Some people walk around in a very overstimulated way of being that can then numb us to incoming sexual information because all the circuits are already activated by that constant intrusion for our attention. You accustom your brain to overstimulation, and then the time frame of real body sex feels artificially too slow.
I'm Cyndi Darnell. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, personal, cultural, scientific, political, and other lenses, and unpack and explore your erotic quandaries with the world's wisest erotic philosophers. Today's guest on The Erotic Philosopher is Ellen Heed. Ellen is a neurodivergent somatic sex educator, fascinated by the dimensionality of the human experience. A former professional dancer, Ellen's career trajectory has included mud wrestling and being a garment business executive. In midlife, she switched to yoga and bodywork as personal practices while teaching anatomy and physiology to a global audience of aspiring professionals, where her online training and rigorous idiosyncratic curriculum supports body-oriented practitioners whose work sits at the crossroads of the physical, emotional, and existential bodies by remediating scars that disturb the flow of information between such domains. In private practice, she conducts birth rehearsals and works hands-on and hands-in with postpartum genitopelvic injuries. She's fascinated by guts and the nervous systems and the nexus of where they exchange information in optimizing our gut-brain conversation to improve function at both ends. Enjoy today's fascinating discussion with Ellen Heed. Ellen Heed, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher.
So good to be here, Cyndi. Good to see you.
It's great to see you. It's been a number of years since I have seen you, and I was first introduced to your work through, the entire field of sexological bodywork. Back in the day, you were one of the people who helped create some of the learning module and the training modules around that field of work. And since then, you've gone into your own work now around scar treatment and scar remediation. But before we get into that, Ellen, for people who have never met you, who don't know anything about you, what would you like them to know about you?
Well, I have defined myself primarily as a teacher. I had a long career teaching anatomy to somatic professionals all over the world, teaching anatomy to sexological body workers, but also to yoga teachers, and working at birth centers, working with midwives, working with doulas, the occasional osteopath, chiropractor, or MD who found their way into a yoga teacher training would seem surprised that I could compress 3 years of medical school into 3 days of anatomy lecture. And they're like, oh, wow, okay, really, we have to know all this. This is important. This is relevant to teaching yoga and energetics. And I'm like, you betcha. I'm really interested in translating using anatomical language between people who are in sexuality and energetic forms of healing work to building a bridge actually between that and a more conventional approach.
And I think, that's in my knowledge of the work that you do and how you teach practitioners to do this work, and certainly the trainings of yours that I undertook. Your knowledge of the human body is above and beyond, certainly the best that I have encountered. And not only your knowledge of how it works, but also how it moves, how it functions, and also what produces different states of awareness, different states of arousal, different states of pleasure, and different states of being. And I think that this is so much of what is missing from a lot of the traditional training with regard to massage therapy, to medical training, and, all of the medical disciplines across the board, not just, traditional medicine, but physical therapy, the entire spectrum.
We can't talk about human beings without talking about their energy. And I came up in my second education, my first education was as a dancer. So I came from a very somatically embodied place. I went to California Institute of the Arts in the 70s and studied dance there. And then was a professional dancer in Los Angeles for some years. And then kind of my knees blew out, and that was the end of dancing. But somehow I found my way in the garment business. I don't know how. I just had an ability to flat pattern draft and make clothing, and I just started doing it. You just fall into things somehow. And I fell into doing that. And I did it for 15 years and then transitioned into, I met a man who so intrigued me by his particular approach to body work. It was so different than anything I'd ever encountered. And it was so compelling in terms of my personal growth, using body work as a whole life potentiator. He was talking about how that was possible. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to follow you around till you show me how to do that. And I apprenticed with this man for 10 years, and he taught me, it was in the context of a shiatsu school. So he was integrating Western and Eastern anatomy and physiology and energetics. He would teach the physiology of an organ, and then he would teach the energetics a la Chinese medicine and the shiatsu perspective of how you would work with that organ hands-on, how you could touch a body part and start to perceive what's going on in a gallbladder, in a liver, in a thyroid, and how different you could map emotions. You know, Asian medicine is full of maps. The meridians are maps, and you can have the whole body mapped in an ear, or the whole body mapped on the palm of the hand, or the sole of the foot. There's all these microcosmic maps of the body within the body. And each of those maps has points, and each of those points do separate things. So getting into the specificity of that was just fascinating to me. And so we were taught to use our hands to heal, literally as medical instruments to heal in a shiatsu context. And so I kind of carried that through, because we understand the nervous system very deeply in Asian medicine, in Chinese medicine in particular. They don't think about the nervous system as separate from the organ system. They're together. And so I didn't learn the false separation. I learned an integrated approach to providing therapy, but always looking at the nervous system as the basis. So that's how I got very interested in the workings of the nervous system. And then I started to study craniosacral therapy. And that took me much deeper into more subtle realms of the nervous system and understanding. I learned from the high end all about cathartic, very dramatic, very post-Reichian, liberationist, emotional, emotional, I don't even know, beyond catharsis, quite dramatic emotional release at the shiatsu school, actually, because that was sort of like this little cult within, a little cult of practitioners were really into that at the shiatsu school. So I learned a lot about that. And then I call that the shallow end of the pool, where all the sympathetic stuff is getting worked out. And then I went into craniosacral and went to the deep end of the pool to learn about the parasympathetic and what's possible in terms of down regulation in the body. And after I had it was a year after I received my craniosacral certification that I studied sexological bodywork. And I took my certification in 2007 with Joseph Kramer, and Chris Maxwell Rose was assisting that training in San Francisco at the Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality. And it blew my mind, but there was a huge missing piece. The missing piece was anatomy. Nobody had names for what they were touching. And I'm like, there are names for these parts, and these parts have functions, and they also are connected to a nervous system. And we need to talk about sexuality in terms of upregulation and what that does, and downregulation and what that does. And when we balance and understand how we work our own internal teeter-totter between upregulation and downregulation, then we can have a better understanding of the function of our sexual being.
So let's sort of pivot in at this point about this notion of the nervous system in relation to sex, in relation to up and down regulation. So for people perhaps who are listening who are not familiar. I mean, people are obviously familiar conceptually with the nervous system, but they may not be familiar with what you mean when you're talking about up and down regulation in the context of sex. Could you describe what you're talking about there?
So arousal is a dance between excitation and relaxation. In order for excitation to happen, there has to be a certain amount of stimulus. And that stimulus is going to be different for different people. Some people are visually stimulated. Some people are stimulated through their ears. Some people are really biased towards hands-on and caress-based stimulation, so skin-based stimulation. And then there is absolute just good old friction on the genitals. And all of those things, all of those inputs will create nervous system responses. And for some people, it depends on your set point. Some people walk around in a very overstimulated way of being just because our culture is biased more and more in that direction. The more time we interact with this, the more stimulation we can accommodate because it's happening all the time. Some people are getting a notification every few seconds, and that ping, ping, ping activates circuitry in the brain around reward that can then numb us to incoming sexual information because all the circuits are already activated by that constant intrusion for our attention. There's very little left for something as subtle as a whisper in the ear, as a caress of the neck, especially if part of our structure of that incoming stimulation is pornography. I'm not saying pornography is bad. Pornography is great, but the monkey mind wants the maximum amount of input. So when you've got your hand on the click, 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 and you know how to navigate from the beginning of a scene to the absolute utmost climax of that scene, and you're hitting climax, 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 novelty, different person, different situation, different climax, you accustom your brain to overstimulation. And then the time frame of real body sex feels artificially too slow.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people experience that sort of discrepancy between, the hyper arousal that can occur with when you're using masturbation or even partnered sex in conjunction with pornography. And then when you're doing it without the pornography, it does feel different. And a lot of people will comment on that, even if you're still running a movie in your head when you're masturbating, it can still it'll feel different again if you remove that movie from your head. And as we're saying, there's nothing wrong with playing the movie in your head. There's nothing wrong with consuming porn. That's not the issue. We're just talking about a much broader, the body's capacity to receive pleasure signals through the nervous system and the flesh that enhance.
We have a certain speed at which our nervous system, we have an operating speed, just like our computer. Computers are only a reflection of what is already happening in our nervous system. We invented computers, we think that we are like computers. No, computers are like us. We were here first. Let's get that straight. But we also have an operating speed, and different people have different operating speeds. That's called a constitution. Some people have a constitutionally slow operating speed. And when they're matched with somebody who has a constitutionally hyperactive or very active operation speed, they may find themselves to be sexually less compatible. And if you get two people who are too slow, they might not ever be able to get to the point of getting aroused.
Yeah, it can be difficult.
Right. So they actually have to figure out who they are and what their arousal style is. But what I'm saying vis-a-vis pornography is it's not the content of the pornography. It's the capacity to stimulate novelty too quickly, to overactivate the dopamine circuitry in the brain. So we become dopamine addicted. We're not even addicted to the sex. We're addicted to the novelty and the speed.
Right. The incentive and the constant chase. Yeah. And more and more of that information is coming out now in relation to brain research around the consumption of porn and, or even not even porn. I mean, Facebook, Instagram, it all ends up being the same sort of thing. It's just that hyperstimulation of the brain circuitry does desensitize us to our capacity to have, old-fashioned human interaction. And then a lot of people talk about sex either being uncomfortable or boring, or they can't get turned on, or...
Yes, they haven't gotten to full arousal, because there's a difference between hyperstimulation and the genital sneeze, which I will qualify as a kind of a minor orgasm, and the amount of full exploration of all the possibilities of upregulation and downregulation multiple times through a sexual engagement cycle that then builds much greater capacity for a much more intense physiologic experience, because there's time for the whole body to catch up with the nervous system.
Right. And I think that's one of the key lessons that I learned from you all those years ago, was the importance of allowing the body time for full arousal. And I think a lot of us tend to think of arousal being, engorgement, wetness, erections, and these kinds of things. And obviously that is arousal. But what I learned from you, if I paraphrase it, is that when we allow the body time to get fully on board, for everything to come online, which can take, up to an hour or perhaps even more in some bodies, it's not just the presence of erections or, dripping vaginas that indicates arousal, although that's part of it, but actually having the entire body coming online as a full organism. And very few people have ever even experienced that, simply because they don't give themselves the time to.
Or they don't even know it's possible. They hear this notion of full body orgasm, but they don't have a clue how they might get there, because they're not taking the time to look for the places between the places where the fingers are, connect to the hand, looking at the place of the inside of the elbow. How about behind the knee? How about around the ankle bones? How about, the armpits? I was just talking to a client last night who had orchestrated a scene where she had ice cream in her armpits, and practitioners were eating the ice cream out of her armpits, and it was so arousing for her.
Wow. And that's the thing, just these odd sensations that we wouldn't normally associate with sex, with the coldness of ice cream, and then armpits that, I guess some people would consider armpits arousing because of the sensitivity of the skin there, but to also add that in to an erotic play for a lot of people is, again, unheard of, because most people tend to associate sex with genitals. And when we understand that, as you say, the inside of the elbow and the back of the knee can be erogenous zones and profoundly arousing, that it really changes the format of how we understand sex. And so, Ellen, you've moved from teaching just these sort of anatomical structures through to now, I think what you're most well known for is your work around scar remediation. So how did you come to that work? And then I want to get into, talking about the nature of what that is.
Sure. It was through sexological bodywork. A sexological bodyworker, someone who had been a coach at my sexological bodywork training, moved to Los Angeles, had a child, had a pelvic floor tear. And she knew I was a fellow sexological bodyworker. She came to me for work. And we discovered very quickly that there was a lot of scar tissue in her pelvic floor. But what really got my attention more than the existence of the scar tissue was the rapidity of healing. That one moment I could have my hands on a scar, and the next moment the scar was gone. Now, this is a very energetically aware person, a lot of Tantra training in the background, and somebody who knew their anatomy exquisitely well. So we were equally matched, and she could say a little bit over, and then I could feel, if I go a little bit over to the left, it feels like a little bead of solid tissue where it should be smooth. It's like it's poking out, and it's stiff and it's solid. And wait a minute, I was just massaging it. Where'd it go? It was just there. I felt it. You felt it. Now it's gone. What happened? nothing in my background had prepared me for, I understood that scars were masses of collagen that were rock hard, impermeable, and you had to just saw away at them in a cross fiber method to get them to loosen up a little bit. And even then you had to do it regularly, or when it got cold, or when it was cold and damp, the scars would start to do that congealy thing. But here was a scar, an intravaginal scar that resolved completely in seconds or milliseconds the minute there was an emotional release.
That
in
is
my client.
Phenomenal.
It blew my mind. I'm like, what the heck? Who are we that we could do that? Really, what is that? So I got very curious. When I get curious, I dive deep. And so I decided to get a PhD to answer that question. What happened?
Very curious.
Very curious. Yeah, really. You know.
I know.
Yes, you do. Yeah, so I was deeply curious, and I decided to turn it into a research question. Is it possible that the human body can have a dramatic and instantaneous release of a collagenous scar due to emotional release inside the vulva and the vagina?
And that was your PhD topic.
That was my research question. Is it possible that this could be true?
And you discovered that it was true.
I described it. I did. I described it because we did research. We had 12 women, and those women all had painful intercourse postpartum. They all had a pelvic floor injury, or they had a cesarean, because there's people were not exempt from pelvic floor problems or painful sex because of a cesarean section at all. That scar tissue can go right down the front face of the uterus and actually fixate. So if this is the uterus and this is the cervix, here's inside the vagina, the scar can grow down the front face of the uterus. Here's the incision. The scar grows down this way and fixates the cervix at the back of the vagina. And then there's no movement, right? And guess what happens during penetration is battering of the cervix as a result of a C-section. And we actually found this in one of the people who was a research subject. And it really took very little work, just ring around the neck of the cervix several times, and it was free. And suddenly, and then this person with 3-year-old twins for whom she'd had a C-section, her uterus went into contractions. The moment that happened, because it was completing the birth process that got interrupted by the C-section.
That is phenomenal.
Blew my mind again.
This information that we know now that's coming through from the world of somatic therapies about, completing the cycles and being allowing the body to go through its full cycle of release, whether it's in relation to, birth trauma and sexual pain, or, trauma of all descriptions, that when it gets stuck in the body, the thinking is that's where it starts to cause harm. And if people can find practitioners who allow them to complete the cycle of whatever it is that's causing them stress and trauma, that can help facilitate and allow the energy to move out of the body and make way for well-being again, which is just, I think it's just such incredibly powerful work now that's coming through from the somatic field. And, the more traditional somatic schools still tend to stay away from sexuality, but that's where your work really bridges that gap and moves in. So you started training with people experiencing birth trauma, and now you've worked with a variety of different genitals. Is
yes,
that right?
I've worked with from birth trauma to genital affirmation surgery to people who are post-prostatectomy or who've had hernia repairs that are affecting their erectile function because maybe the mesh is placed in the midline, and then the midline starts to create scar tissue, which then affects erectile function or creates pain on ejaculation. For people with penises, or, there are all number of kinds of injuries that can hurt the clitoris and its enclosure in the hood, from autoimmune conditions to birth injuries to sports injuries, et cetera. So we have to look at the whole body health now, because if it's an autoimmune condition that's causing lichen sclerosis, that is a scar propagating condition. And it creates this occult scar tissue all around. And I've seen people whose clitoral hoods have actually closed over the glands entirely. And so because of
from an injury?
No, from lichen sclerosis, which is an autoimmune condition.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
And so for people who, I just want to sort of pivot back to people who had gender affirming surgeries. So that's where one set of genitals is transformed into a different set of genitals through surgery. For dissolving the scars in those kinds of situations, have you seen similar effects?
I've seen remarkable results. Yes,
okay.
I have. I can tell a story of working with a trans woman who had incredibly painful penetration. Their experience of penetration was like shards of glass coming inside. Very, very painful. And so I used a lot of castor oil and went in very slowly. And what I felt inside the walls of this neo-vagina was little pieces of erectile tissue starting to become engorged. And the person could feel those pieces of erectile tissue. And for the first time, it's like something connected with their map of self. In between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe of the brain lives the homunculus, our internal map of self. Some wires got reconnected there that got obliterated by the surgery because nerves had been cut and things have been radically rearranged. But somehow that erectile tissue, taking time to acknowledge, wow, engorgement is happening here. How does that feel to you? Oh, I know what that feels like. It feels like I'm getting an erection. Oh my goodness. And so that started some rewiring happening in this person's system that then gave them an alternative to shards of glass being inside their neovulva.
Amazing. And so this again is, this powerful information that even when, tissue is damaged, nerves are severed, that the brain and the neural pathways are able to reroute themselves
That's called neuroplasticity.
In some fashion. Right.
Yes.
To recreate erotic pathways for people who have had, and you said also prostatectomies you've worked with.
Yes, I've worked with prostatectomies, and sometimes successful, sometimes not, because sometimes the nerve damage is too extreme. And you're typically working with people who are in their 8th decade or their late 7th decade. And so the ability of the body to build, because they have so much habit of the way sex has always been for them, it's more difficult to establish new habits, new pathways, but boy, do they try. There's all kinds of suction devices and ways of, coaxing blood into a penis post-prostatectomy, injections and so on and so forth, that become a new way of having intercourse. And then there are some people who said, I'm fine without having an erection. I still can have a pleasurable orgasm with no erection. And so just even presenting that as a paradigm for people and really permissioning that as legitimate as a way to enjoy your sexuality in a time when your ordinary plumbing isn't doing what it used to do. In terms of, blood and erections and so forth.
Right. And I mean, this is, this happens at some level to all of us, regardless of, obviously if we have extreme trauma or illness or something like that, the onset is going to be more rapid. But as our bodies age, they change in their functionality anyway. So all of us are, on a trajectory towards change, physiological change in the genital area, which is going to impact our sex lives, no matter whether we want it to or not, it will. So the more we can understand this and the more we can learn about this, the better quality our sex life is going to be from when we are young through to when we are, just before our death. So I know that you're sort of, again, having another career pivot and looking at training more people in these modalities that you've created. But before we get into that, Ellen, I just do want to ask one more thing. For people who are listening to you, who may live in a part of the world where they can't access your scar tissue massage people, or if for whatever reason it's, hands-on genital massage is illegal or immoral or whatever variation, these laws exist globally. Are there things people can do to themselves or with their partners where they can experiment with this without the risk of causing any major or even minor harm to themselves?
So I would say, yes, people should make friends with castor oil. And that being said, very occasionally someone will have an extreme allergy to castor oil. So always best to test first. The way you would do that is you could take a drop of castor oil and you could touch it at the side of the tongue or on a mucosal membrane of some kind, inside of the anus or inside of the foreskin, wherever or inside of a labial lip. And if there's no reaction, you're probably good to apply it liberally. So then you would try it, or you could even try it on the inside of your wrist. And if you got red on the inside of your wrist with the tight junctions of skin, you wouldn't want to go anywhere near the more open junctions of a mucosal membrane where the absorption would be that much faster, because there's actually fenestrations or windows between those cells in a mucosal membrane. So they absorb castor oil more rapidly and more of it because the cell structure is looser in a mucosal membrane. So castor oil is very effective at softening scar tissue and also increasing lymphatic drainage.
Oh, okay. And so people could apply a self-massage technique using castor oil, and would it be something that they would do daily?
I don't recommend it daily because of the potential for sensitization. So if some people are fine daily for 4 or 5 days, and they might get a little itching or a little burning. And that means, the body is sensitizing to the castor oil, in which case you lay off for a day or two, and then you can try and reapply, but you wouldn't do it every day. You do it 1 day out of 3.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good for many, 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 many people. There's the occasional person who can tolerate no castor oil. And then there are the occasional people who can tolerate castor oil daily.
And so one must, use their intelligence to determine whether or not their body is going to be responsive in the affirmative to castor oil. And the massage, you starting off with gentle sort of strokes or moving into firmer strokes, breaking down the scar.
The idea is to massage the castor oil to find the scar using your own. So I really am a big fan of genital mapping. And genital mapping is available. All kinds of people offer online genital mapping programs and scripts, basically. And so anyone can map themselves. And so if you can map yourself genitally, perhaps you will come across a scar. If you know you had an injury like a tear during childbirth or a hysterectomy or some kind of cesarean section, there's a surgery or there's an injury. So if you know that happened to you, then you'll know that there's some scar tissue where the skin came back together. And you want to feel that area and notice if there's any lumpy, bumpy, hard, tougher tissue there. And that's where you would massage the castor oil with the expectation that massage will begin to soften the tissue.
And so how long would it take, do you think, before people would notice that there would be a softening of the scar tissue if they were doing
If it's on the vulva mucosa, the actual vulva tissue itself, it could soften in one application.
Wow.
That happens all the time.
Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing.
Just amazing.
Castor oil is very potent. It's very high in ricinoleic acid, and ricinoleic acid is a very potent anti-inflammatory. A scar is an inflammation process that has not resolved. So the body, in response to that inflammatory process, keeps producing the kind of collagen that makes scar tissue with the potential to create. There's 28 species of collagen that any given fibroblast has the option of creating. We want it to select for a normal kind of collagen, not a scar kind of collagen. In the presence of the ricinoleic acid of castor oil, it will select for a more normal kind of collagen because it's not inflamed.
So that's how that all works. That's just remarkable. And so, speaking of remarkable, your knowledge is second to none, and you're looking now at teaching more and more people about this work with your new sort of professional pivot. So, for people listening who are thinking, "My goodness, I want to go and learn about this," what will they learn if they come to you?
Oh, well, it's very interesting. I have created a 2-year program. It takes 2 years to understand the body sufficiently to not only work with the physical scar, but there is an emotional response that accompanies a scar dissolution, and learning how to hold space for that emotional response takes more training than just learning how to go in and do the what you do with your hands. Learning how to hold space for the emotional body, and then building a bridge between the emotional body and the cognitive body, and then mapping that back onto the physical body. But then there's existential scar tissue, which we have to talk about. And that's the scar tissue of what's imposed by our culture, our beliefs. If we don't believe we can heal, we can't heal. But if we believe we can heal and we make space, it's amazing what can happen. That's what surprised me. I was like, you can't change a scar. Scars are forever. Like, that wasn't true. So, but it only was true that people had the rapid dissolution, the instantaneous dissolution of scar tissue when they had an emotional release, and they didn't have a lot of inflammatory titers in their body to begin with. They had to be baseline healthy, not a lot of inflammation. They had to be emotionally available, and they had to get the right manual manipulation of their tissue. So that takes a while to train. And then also, people who study with me then become educators, because you can't talk about scars, sexuality, and genitalia without doing a lot of education, because mapping is so critical to, we map everything. We map the existential body, the emotional body, the physical body, the genital body. We map, we locate people in their experience. So once they understand where they are, if they really understand where they are, that's half the equation.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, because traditionally all of the kind of healing professions have been so segmented and so separated that there's, the talk therapists who only do the talking. For many years, it was all very sort of cognitive and thought-based. Now it's sort of moving into a blend of cognitive and emotional. And then there's the body workers and the body people who don't do the cognitive stuff, and they maybe dip into the emotional stuff, but often not really, or perhaps not very well. And then the energetic stuff, the energy people who can often be very woo-woo and not very grounded, and they're very uncomfortable with the cognitive stuff. And so, it sounds like the program that you're creating brings all of those elements into play, and to say, these, not that we necessarily have to be expert in all of these areas, but certainly it helps if we can be across.
We have to be conversant, at least conversant and grounded. And when you're conversant and grounded and have competency, and when somebody's wounding, their essential wounding is in the existential, meaning their beliefs around what's possible for them. Maybe they were raised in a very strict religious sect, that there were a lot of sexual proscriptions that are baked into their nervous system. That's a very particular kind of wounding that then may or may not layer onto physical wounding and the scar from that. But if you don't address that existential scar tissue in the belief system, what's possible for the physical tissue is limited. Yes, you can apply all the castor oil in the world to the scar, but if there's no belief around it's my right to have a full body orgasm and I really want to get there, and that may not be the be all end all, but it's my right to have sexuality at all. Yeah, that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and that, I think, is one of the most powerful undoings that comes with this work. And in my experience of being trained initially in some of the erotic massage work, and then going and training as a psychotherapist, and then actually flipping back and going, the psychotherapy stuff's interesting, but to my mind, it was very limited in what I could do and what I had discovered in working with people's bodies, and what, how far you can get with somebody, with a client. You can, in a couple of sessions, doing body work and even breath work, what might take 3 or 6 months with just talk therapy.
Yes, exactly. And so the body is a great shortcut.
Being able to combine the body work with the talking, with the emotional stuff, and, the cultural, social, political piece, the esoteric piece, that it all has to be part of it, especially when it comes to sex, because sex intersects with all
everything.
Of those
That's why
parts.
Sex is so sexy. Because it does. It is the place. I mean, when Joe Kramer asked me to design anatomy for sexological body workers, I was so excited, because sexological body workers are in such a position to communicate with all these aspects of a person at the most neuroplastic part of being any living being, which is sexuality. That is neuroplastic. And it can be neuroplastic gone wrong or neuroplastic repaired. And this sort of brings us around to what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation. How habituated do we allow ourselves to become to doing sex certain ways that limit our neuroplasticity? Like, we have to have maximum amount of stimulation visually, or through media, or through fantasy, or, we have to, the mind has to be so occupied and distracted that there's hardly any space for body sensations at all, or the body sensations have to be brought up to such a peak of stimulus that there's no room for the subtlety and feeling the energetic potential of what's happening.
Yeah, right. And so you're saying now that you're not going to be doing, people aren't going to be coming to you for consultations anymore while you move and you start to now become solely a teacher trainer. Is that right?
I will be available for some consultations, but mainly virtual. I have to get a massage license where I'm moving so I can work. And that, I don't know how long that will take. I have to go back to massage.
Yeah, I find that astounding that you, of all people, have to go and get a license. You could be the head of the licensing board all by yourself. I think that's remarkable. So with your training programs for practitioners, practitioners in waiting, will it be an in-person program? Obviously, given the
so
COVID.
It's a mixed program. It's a 2-year program, and the first year is absorption and mainly online. The second year, there are a number of in-person workshops. And if somebody is a particularly aggressive or interested or urgent student, or somebody who has a lot of hands-on experience, they would be invited to attend their hands-on workshops in the first year. So there's flexibility, but it's a 2-year program. The first year, absorption and mentorship. It's very much one-on-one. I spend a lot of time, 6 to 8 mentorship sessions, talking to people about how they're relating to the program. I don't give a rat's ass, honestly, with anyone keeping up with the schedule at the rate that the program drips. What I care about is how it's touching their lives and how they're reorganizing themselves and their nervous system around what they're learning, because that's where we start. The first module is called Assessing the Unseen, which is the nervous system. The second module is Addressing the Body. How do we work with the biochemical body, the biomechanical body, the emotional body, and the scar body? The third module is Working with Genitals. And the fourth module is a lot of work around postpartum and how we as practitioners need to take care of ourselves to walk the walk. So how do you cleanse your liver? How do you take care of your insomnia? What do you do when you're suffering burnout? If we don't have these tools, we're not going to have longevity in a profession where we're continually confronted with trauma.
That's such a wonderful addition to, the variety of clinical approaches that people can take. And I am so glad, Ellen Heed, that you exist in the world and that you're putting this program out there. And of course, for people who are listening and watching this video, your links are going to be in the show notes for people to follow up with you. So for people who are all ears about what you're doing, I would encourage them to absolutely reach out to you. Ellen, it's been utterly delightful catching up with you again after all these years, and that you've been keeping well during COVID. And I really wish you all the best with your move into this new physical location and also new professional space. It's a feat having to, changing homes and changing professions. But I wish you all the best with it. I think the world absolutely needs what you have to offer.
Oh, well, I'm so excited to be doing this. And thank you so much, Cyndi. It's been a delight to speak with you.
I hope you enjoyed today's discussion with Ellen Heed and learned some really fascinating things about our bodies and how they work and their relationship to sex and pleasure that's far more textured and complicated and, nuanced than just sex in the way that we conventionally tend to understand it. And really that is sort of at the crux of what so many people struggle with in sex and relationships, is the limited knowledge that most of us receive about these things and how they impact us and our ability to actually create sex lives and relationships that are meaningful, that are sustainable, and that are nourishing and full of pleasure. And speaking of pleasure, you may know, but I'll remind you one more time, my book, Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, is coming out in June this year of 2022, and you can pre-order it or back order it or just plain order it, depending on whenever you're listening to this, on my website. If you head to my website, cyndidarnell.com, CyndiDarnell.com, you'll see the book tab there and the information about that book, specifically geared towards people who are in partnerships where libidos are mismatched, which really is probably everybody in relationships, because mismatched libido is so incredibly common, and it's not always an indication that something is wrong. It's just something to be managed and assessed. And my book aims to support you with that physically, somatically, emotionally, cognitively, scientifically. All the things are there. I hope you'll enjoy it. While you're hanging out on my website, it's also the home of The Erotic Philosopher. You'll see the podcast tab there, and there is a link to leave us a review on iTunes. I would love it if you took a couple of minutes to head on over to iTunes and rate and review The Erotic Philosopher podcast. That's how other people get to find this. That's how other people get to hear these amazing interviews with extraordinary thinkers, feelers, doers in the realm of sex and relationships. You can also follow The Erotic Philosopher on Instagram and Twitter. We are at The Erotic Philos. That's PHILOS. While you're hanging out on my website, you can hang out at the Online Pleasure School. You can select that tab there under the online courses and check out the suite of classes that I have pre-recorded, ready for you to take at home from anywhere you are in the world. Take a look around. You'll find something there for everyone. If you want more personalized support with your sex and relationship problems, you might consider working with me one-on-one, two-on-one, five-on-one. I offer online support in the form of counseling, coaching and therapy to individuals, couples and groups all over the world. You'll see that there on the services tab on my website. You can also follow me on social media at Cyndi_Darnell. That's CYNDI_DARNELL. Thanks for joining me again on another episode of The Erotic Philosopher. I love being able to whisper in your ear every now and again and bring you the wisdom of some of the people whose work I find so incredibly nourishing and inspiring in my quest to change the way we understand sex and relationships, one conversation at a time. Until we're together again, thanks for listening and take care.